Bless you. Some things you cannot prepare for. I'm actually speaking about the weather. Over 50% of the people on the beam are from New York, so you'll understand this, but you can actually prepare for a snowstorm and a blizzard. The meteorologists will tell you when the snow is coming and where it's going to land and how long it will be there for. The same thing is true if you're from the southeast and hurricane season. You can know where the eye of the storm is, where it will land, how much rain will fall. You can even board up your windows and, God forbid, even evacuate if needed. But there are other things that we cannot prepare for. Last week, I was on a Zoom call sitting in my home, and the walls began to shake. You might have felt it too. There was an earthquake. There was no way for me to understand at that moment, until that moment, that earthquake was going to happen. And that, of course, is a small scale, but on a much grander scale, nationally or even internationally. Almost 20 years ago, I remember walking into a biology class at Columbia University. The sky was blue over my head. And an hour later, when I walked out, the thick, dark, black cloud of smoke over my head. 9/11. Something that I did not prepare for, that I could not have prepared for. And I know those people who walked in those buildings that morning of the World Trade Center, they could have never prepared for that either. And I bring that distinction between preparation and events that we cannot prepare for, because in the Jewish calendar right now, we are in the period of Bein HaMetzarim, which in English we translate as the 3 weeks, but really the literal translation is, we are in the straits of distress. Those 3 weeks began last Sunday, the 17th day of Tammuz, a minor fast day on the calendar, but commemorating the original Roman siege of the walls of Jerusalem. And the 3 weeks end in a couple of weeks on Tisha B'Av. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now we're sitting here thousands of years later with 2020 hindsight, thinking to ourselves, they had to have seen what was coming within those 3 weeks. The siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. But I don't think it's true. How could they have known? We give all these different spiritual reasons, sinat chinam, senseless hatred, why the temple was destroyed. But I don't think it is something that they could have prepared for. And while they could not have prepared for destruction, the one thing that we do know that they prepared for all their lives is recovery. Recovery. It says so in the Talmud, a beautiful, well-known story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was in Jerusalem during the siege. And he fakes his own death, and he's taken out from Jerusalem in a coffin. And he goes to see Vespasian. And he tells Vespasian, I have a vision. One day, Vespasian, you will be the emperor. But I have a favor to ask. He says, if this vision comes true, I want you to protect the scholars of a small place in the north called Yavne. Well, Vespasian becomes the emperor one day, and he does that favor for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He protects the scholars of Yavne. And we know that we are standing here today as Jews in the 21st century because that favor was granted. That small group of scholars was protected during destruction because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he understood that the word recovery was as important as destruction. And even though that place was called Yavne, there have been so many more Yavnes throughout the years of Jewish history. Let's begin just a year ago. I will never forget the day that our clergy and staff gathered in this building, and we were told for an indefinite amount of time, this temple, this synagogue, our sacred walls would be closed. It was destruction. And at the same time, I remember in that meeting, we looked around and we focused on recovery. From that day, and it looked a little different until we returned, we never missed a minyan. We never missed a bar and bat mitzvah. We never missed a life cycle moment because we had to create a Yavne of the 21st century. Destruction, but the focus is recovery. You know, when you look up the Hebrew word recovery in the dictionary, you don't only get one word, as is the case with Hebrew many times, but you get multiple words of different variations of recovery. But the recovery and the word of recovery that I want to present today in Hebrew is tikuma, which has the root lakum, which means to get up, which means to rebuild, which means to resist, which means to recover. And throughout Jewish history, not just a year ago in this building, it has always been the case with our leaders that when they saw a moment of destruction that they could not even have prepared for, recovery was a must. I'm in the midst of reading different biographies of Zionist leaders that created the state of Israel that only had visions before there was a state. And this week I completed the one of David Ben-Gurion. When you ask somebody today who was David Ben-Gurion, they say he's an airport. Much more than an airport. Because David Ben-Gurion was born in Planks in Eastern Europe. And just like Herzl, he only had a dream. And he worked hard for this dream, and there were many mishaps and many points where he could have given up. But in 1945, after the Shoah, David Ben-Gurion tells the story of going into a DP camp in Eastern Europe and literally seeing skeletons walking around. And at that moment, just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he focused on recovery. And so what did he do? He had a program that he understood that in order for the state to exist, for the people needed to be there for the state. And so he led the program of mass immigration from these people whose lives were literally destroyed. And he brings them to what will then be called, just a few years later, the State of Israel. And I bring David Ben-Gurion up not because it's a miraculous story, but because it's a story of Jewish recovery. And just last week, we saw another moment of this Jewish recovery from the land of Israel. You may or might not have seen this video, but if you did not, I urge you after Shabbat to go find it online. There was a video that went viral this week of the Israeli rescue team in Surfside, Florida, doing what they always do, wherever it is in the world, to help recover. It was last Friday evening when this video was taken or posted. The team of Israeli rescuers wearing goggles and helmets and fluorescent shirts, they're standing in a circle, and in the background you see other firefighters continuing to put out the fires that were within that rubble. And the leader takes a kos yayin kiddush, takes a kiddush cup that we have right here that we will say in a few moments, and says the words, Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz, b'chol tzava'am. God on Shabbat finished creating the heavens and the earth. When we say those words every Friday night, God entrusts us, you, me, each one of us, that this is our world. And even when there is destruction, it is our obligation for that recovery. Destruction in life and loss of life was obvious. But in that moment of Kiddush, and I watched it over and over again as it gave me the chills, that moment of Kiddush was the moment of recovery. You know, there's a debate in the Jewish world. Should the 3 weeks of mourning, the Bein HaMetzarim, should it even matter to us in 2021? We have a Jerusalem. It's unified. And if you asked me a decade or a decade and a half ago, I would say probably not. It's not relevant to who we are as Jews today. But if you ask me today, I would say I stand corrected. 3,000 years ago, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai needed it. 80 years ago, David Ben Gurion needed it. And today, even more than ever, I firmly believe that we as Jews, we need these 3 weeks. Because these 3 weeks, these Bein HaMetzarim, they allow us to focus on two things at the same time. We know, as you can turn on any news channel, that there will always be inevitably some moments of destruction. But we as Jews, Asirei Tikva, prisoners, but prisoners of hope, we know that we have the ability, the obligation, and the need to recover. And so in that same exact moment as the walls of Jerusalem fall down, we know there will be somebody to create the next Academy of Yavne, somebody to bring our people together from the far corners of this earth, somebody to simply hold that Kiddush cup in the air, Mekadesh HaShabbat, to sanctify this Sabbath day that we have eternally been given. And so for us, on this July 4th weekend of the 3 weeks, we know as Jews that recovery does not wait for that next prophet to tell us, but recovery, tikkumah, establishing a thriving Jewish world, establishing a thriving Jewish world for all of God's creatures. It begins with you, it begins with me, and it begins with us together. Shabbat Shalom.